Thank you, and thank you for the team, that allowed to make this possible. It is my great pleasure today to introduce the topic of gender and democracy in Brazil and beyond with Flávia Biroli. She's a professor of political science at the Institute of Political Science of the University of Brasília, master and Ph.D. in political history. She moved to political science. She's a productivity researcher at the National Council for Scientific and Technological Development. She was the president of the Brazilian Political Science Association till 2020, the president of the Mercosur Women's Fund, participate in a group as expert for UN Women, and I can continue on and on. She has published many books and articles about gender and democracy in Brazil and beyond, and comparative perspective. What I would like to say about Flávia is that she goes with her questioning, takes her. She doesn't get constrained by dimensions of disciplines. She's no shy of depth and width to advance equality for women and for all. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Flávia Biroli.
Thank you very much, Mara. Thank you, Derek. It's a great pleasure for me to be part of the conversatory today and to meet you all. So thank you very much for your invitation. I'm glad that we can talk today.
Yeah, me too. I'm very excited. So you started with political history and you started with voting representation for women. What did you see then, and how did you move on to issues of public policy, family, care?
Mm-hmm. So maybe it's interesting to tell you that my first research topics, they were around media and democracy in Brazil. So my first research on women in politics was a investigation on how women politicians were portrayed, were framed by the Brazilian media, the Brazilian main newspapers and TV networks. And that's how I actually entered the field of research on women's rights, and the participation of women in politics in particular. But once I started researching women's participation in politics, maybe I could tell you just a piece of information about it. Brazil is one of the countries in the world with the lowest rates of women's participation in Congress as deputies. And we have now a quota law that has been adopted 25 years ago, and we are still one of the countries with the lowest rates of women in Congress. So once I started investigating this and the reasons for that, I had to deal with family issues, with what we call the sexual division of labor, and how it created obstacles for women to participate in the public sphere. So that's how I kind of, not that I have abandoned political participation, but I changed my focus a little to understand how public policy for women can be important even for women to be able to participate politically.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what were the obstacles, and what did you see where these connections between public policy vis-a-vis the family, public policy vis-a-vis the division of labor, and the obstacles to political participation? And if you can explain what quotas are, it would be great as well.
Okay, great. Okay, so in Brazil, we have electoral quotas for women to guarantee a minimum of election, a minimum of female election in proportional elections. So for state deputies, national deputies, this law corresponds to these elections. And Argentina was the first country in Latin America to adopt quota laws to guarantee a minimum of women elected in 1991. And Brazil adopted such a law in 1997. But, well, I don't know if you'd be interested in that. I'll just be short about it. But we have open electoral lists by political parties. That means that even though by our law, it's necessary to have 30%, this is the minimum, of women as candidates, this does not mean that the political parties support these candidacies in equal terms if we compare them to male candidacies. So what happened in Brazil differently from Argentina? Argentina now has a parity laws. So in Argentina now, not only the 30%, which were the initial minimum in the law in 1991, are really correspondent to how many women are elected, but there is a parity law that guarantees an even election of women and men. In Brazil, political parties were really not, let's say, willing to support women's candidacies. And because we have open electoral lists and voters can choose names in the list, and women did not have the same support as men, we still have, so that you have an idea, we still have 15% of women in Congress in Brazil, which is one of the lowest rates in Latin America. My studies, my research tried to bring other dimensions to these obstacles besides the institutional one. And so there are issues concerning the law in our electoral system. There are issues concerning how political parties act in which respects women's and men's candidacies, but there is also something related to how women accommodate and have difficulties accommodating a public life, a political life, and family needs, and in particular, caring responsibilities. So then I tried to understand by interviewing politicians, how women and male politicians, they receive different incentives, but they also face different obstacles from the moment they decided to be a candidate. It's not only to be elected. It starts from the moment they start being part of the political public life. So the sexual division of labor presents itself as a big issue for gender studies, for feminist perspectives, willing to build a more equalitarian society. And it's interesting because even when women have professional works, are recognized for these professional trajectories, we have data showing that they spend more than twice the time of men every week to care for other people and do domestic work. So this brings us to think of how the obstacles to participate, to have a public life, they are connected to how we organize our society. It's not only how the institutions are designed and work, how political parties behave themselves, political leaders towards women, but also how do we organize our societies. I always like to say that there is a question that we should ask each other every day. Who takes care of the children? Who takes care of those who need support? Be them elderly people or people now with the COVID pandemic who need extra care. So what does this has to do with politics? Well, it has a lot to do with politics. First, because of everything I said till now. But second, because if those who take care of children in daily basis are not the politicians, maybe our politicians do not see how important this is in people's day-to-day life.
That's a great point, Flavia, and it's analogous to the issues of, care, family, and the economy as well that Nancy Fraser, for example, works on. I mean, how can you really have full participation in the economy and equal pay if you also take care of care, right? I want to ask you, before going, very deep into what this means for the political landscape today, to do a little kind of recap. The feminist movements in Latin America are very strong. They come out of dictatorships, and the struggle for human rights. I mean, I wear also always my, kerchief, and it actually, the feminist movement takes the symbol of the mothers of Plaza de Mayo, or Mayo. How would you characterize, right, this struggle and this fusion, between human rights, coming out of dictatorships with feminist issues of women and gender?
That's a great question, Mara. Thank you, because I think this is one thing that is important to have in mind. The feminist agenda is a human rights agenda. When we speak of gender rights, we speak of human rights. And if we if we take a look of how at the human rights international system, we will see that it develops in a way that expands to include issues such as gender and race as it becomes stronger and as it brings up debates related to how the national states guarantee human rights for its citizens and for individuals in particular. So even formally speaking, we are discussing gender today, and at least since the 1970s, as part of the human rights system, international system. Well, if we think of the post-Second World War, that's when our human rights system starts developing, and what comes next has to do with that context of guaranteeing cooperation to keep human rights as a priority in different countries of the world and in a global scene that has this agenda as a central one. But for our Latin American countries at the moment, if we think of the 1960s and 70s, they were going through very authoritarian military regimes, which were the opposite of guarantees to plurality and human rights. And women engaged in the opposition against the dictatorships as students, but also as mothers, as sisters, as teachers. It's also interesting to see how women engaged in the opposition against the dictatorships because they were part of communitarian actions many times related to the Catholic Church in Latin America, to more progressive branches of the Catholic Church. And when we start the transition to democracy in our countries, in Latin America, women were part of those actors disputing what kind of state would be this new democratic liberal state. And what they did was to bring the idea that any democracy should be defined as such, should have not only human rights, basic individual guarantees as part of its agenda, but also women rights and a way to produce constitutional guarantees that was aware of the kind of violence and the restrictions to rights that affected women in particular. So this is something that I would connect. Not only gender is part of the human rights international system, but also the struggles for human rights and democracy in Latin America. They had women, feminist movements at the core of the processes that built the new constitutions, the new state in Latin America from the 1970s and 80s.
Yeah, that's a great, thank you, Flávia, for that characterization, because if I may add, the state in dictatorship was conceived in a very patriarchal way. So it was the family of, with the head of the juntas as the father, with very established roles. So it was reflecting the traditional structure of the family, where everyone had it's her, his, them, when those pronouns were not used then, right? A place with the paterfamilias. So
yeah, the family was part of this imaginarium, the representation of the nation, but conceived in a very conventional, strict way. Yes, that many times did not correspond to how real families lived.
Exactly. So you work a lot, there are so many issues. You work a lot about violence against women. And I would like you to expand, on this notion and also the relationship between, you talk, women and gender kind of interchangeably, but there is a difference, but also like a deep connection. So if we can first, address that and then move on, what is, violence against women and gender, and how you expanded that notion and why it's important.
Okay, thanks, Mara. Great. Well, so first, my work on violence against women is mostly focused on political violence against women, or what we call gendered political violence. And it's interesting because what we saw in many parts of the world, not only in Latin America, but Latin America was really the stage for a new development of these concepts and public policy to deal with it. What we saw was that gendered violence affecting women politicians and women activists increased as women started to be elected in higher rates, or to pressure the electoral system and parties to really guarantee their participation. So Latin America was the stage for the first law typifying violence against women in politics, which is a law from Bolivia from 2012. Yeah, 2012. It's recent. It's really recent. And it has really become an important issue, because it's not enough to guarantee that women can participate as candidates or even be elected if we are not able to guarantee that they can be part of politics without the cost of violence, of humiliation, and sometimes even murder of women who are elected. So it's interesting because one of the issues in the development of the concept of violence against women in politics had to do with whether this violence was just part of a general violence against women in Latin America in particular, or we had a kind of violence which was specific to specifically concerned to the disputes related to the political space, not only institutionally speaking, but also activism. And now it's really kind of a established understanding that violence against women in politics is a reaction to women's political participation. So it's not just like a subtype of general violence. And it's interesting because one of the conceptual discussions, very, very strong debate around that, is whether we should define it as violence against women in politics or as gender violence or violence, gender political violence. And well, when we say violence against women in politics, we are defining the subject that is affected by this violence. When we say gender violence in politics, we are approaching the relations that make some subjects vulnerable to some kinds of violence. And this has to do with how and why the concept of gender has been adopted in the last decades. We have not abandoned the concept of woman. It's interesting, the other day I was reading a PhD thesis, and the author said, well, the platform of Beijing, which is the platform which was produced by the Fourth World Conference on Women in 1995, that took place in Beijing, replaced women by gender in its elaboration of rights. And I had recently participated in the review, the 25 years review of the platform of Beijing, and I said, oh, I'm sorry, there is no replacement. Gender comes as a new approach, which does not replace women as a subject. But why is it a new approach? Because it highlights relations, socially established relations. So instead of looking at individuals or looking at women's conditions in society, the idea is you look at how relations socially established in social process throughout the time, throughout history, define roles which are not only different, but also unequal for women and men in society. And in this movement, define what is understood by us as male and female in society.
So that's a great point. That was going to be my next question, but it wasn't. Then, because once you give rights to individuals, you may not. I mean, the suggestion is that you may not actually change the underlying structure of relations and hierarchies and inequalities. And the more women participate and the more with their participation they defy those relationships, the more backlash they get. And here we get to, the core of your latest research, because if we think about, what you just said, that the more women participate in politics, the more violence, they get. And this is the point in which, the backlash comes not only in terms of like physical violence, but symbolic violence, right? And political in the sense of discourse, in terms of gender ideology. And in this gender ideology, there are all sorts of assumptions that go to the core of, defying gender roles and hierarchies. Can you please talk about that?
Of course. As you have said, this is really at the core of my current research. And I've actually started researching these resource to gender ideology as a political strategy in Brazil and other Latin American countries, as I started to understand that it was not only a new political strategy connected to a backlash against women's rights and gender equality, but also that it was not a national issue or even a regional issue. So it was interesting. If you allow me, I will only tell you just a very short story. I was at the time, I was with a team by my university. We were investigating, we were researching how struggles concerning abortion in our Congress, they had evolved from the 1980s until the beginning of the new millennium and the years, the 21st century. And because what we wanted to understand at the time with this research had to do with how politicians and activists advocating for or against the right to abortion, how did they frame their arguments? How did they justify their positions? And well, as we were researching that, we started to understand that the concept of gender had become part of these struggles. And that there was this, at the moment, very new idea that some ideology which feminist movements were, circulating around the world was responsible for the weakening of the family. And so actors advocating against the right to abortion, they brought the idea of gender ideology to say that there was a way to frame women's rights and women's autonomy that was the opposite of the possibility to keep the family as the core unity of social order. And well, we started to, at first there was this speech by one deputy, one congressman, and we were like, what is this now? What's this gender ideology? This was 2013. So that's how long we look back to see how when gender ideology started to be a political concept to politicize gender against gender rights, against women's rights. And then we started to look closer to that to understand where did that expression came from. And it's interesting because this congressman in particular, he was an evangelic congressman from a Pentecostal church. But once I started studying this issue, I understood that actually the idea of gender ideology, it comes from the 1990s, from ideologues which are Catholic. So the first document in which the idea of gender, the concept of gender ideology appears is a document by the Catholic Church in Peru. It's interesting, in 1997, so right after the Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing that I mentioned before. So gender ideology started to be used by Catholic ideologues against the use of gender by feminist and human rights advocates in the conferences of the UN in the 1990s, in particular the Fourth Conference on Women of Beijing, 1995. So it was a reaction against the idea that beyond speaking of and guaranteeing women's rights, it was important to denaturalize the hierarchies of gender. it was important to denaturalize the kind of justified inequality that crossed relations in society, defining women as less capable of men, to different kinds of trajectories in society, but also defining men and women in opposite, complementary, and naturalized ways. So it had to do both with gender roles and with sexuality and sexual roles. This came together as part of the reframing of gender relations in society.
Yes. So when there is this backlash, to use your word and the word of many that are working on this very acute phenomenon, not only in Brazil, we can talk about the particularities of Bolsonaro, but also in Poland, in Hungary, it happened in Argentina, because what this opposition against, gender ideology, or this coining of gender ideology has done, was articulate a configuration of very heterogeneous actors to oppose. You have on the one hand, the strange bedfellows of neoliberals who oppose gender ideology because they don't want the state to regulate, right, on the excuse of individual rights, when in fact it's sustaining hierarchies, because it's the natural family. And on the other hand, neoconservatives, right, who do not want to, as you just mentioned, denaturalize, the family, and basically neither want to attempt against gender hierarchies.
It's interesting, Mara, because since the 1990s, these alliances, they are kind of surprising. Even throughout the conferences, the UN conference in the 1990s, one first surprise was to see the Catholic Church and Arab countries and Muslims working together against gender in the name of the family. But we could ask from that moment, how did these different religious institutions see the family? Did they conceive the family really in equal terms, in similar terms? And does the family mean the same in different societies? So what were they advocating for? Well, what we know is what they were advocating against. They were advocating against gender rights in a perspective that denaturalized hierarchies, as you said. Well, as these campaigns against gender develop further, in particular in the 21st century, we see more and more this that you have mentioned, how neoliberal perspectives and actors, they are allied to and share the same frameworks to advocate against gender equality. What I have been discussing in my research, and other colleagues have been doing that as well, has to do with how the idea of what is private and what's public is important to these campaigns against gender. How the role defined as the legitimate role of the state is also part of how this is defined. Because in Brazil, for example, what do we see happening at the same time? We see the actors questioning and organizing a very concrete backlash against gender rights, at the same time that they advocate against some social rights that have been adopted since transition in our new social constitution in 1988. So
transition to democracy. I'm clarifying for the audience, yes.
Yeah.
Because dictatorship is very much in your mind and my mind,
yes,
maybe not in the minds of
so
the
because
audience.
our transition to democracy was also a transition framed as a transition to a social democracy in many ways. Our constitution, our current constitution, which was adopted in 1988 after 20 years of military dictatorship, it's really marked by the adoption of guarantees, which we can define as distributive guarantees. For example, guarantee to public education, guarantee to public health, guarantee to social security. And it's interesting that all these guarantees, labor guarantees, they are very important as the basis for us to be able to build gender equality on. And when we start the 21st century and have this backlash, it is simultaneously a backlash against gender rights, gender equality, and social rights, such as labor rights. So the family, the idea that these actors are all advocating in defense of the family, comes in two different meanings. One is, well, women should be complementary to men. The family is so important to reproduce a certain moral order. But on the other hand, it is also, well, if there is not public daycare, if there is not public health, well, who is going to take care of other people? So not only the family gets this strong responsibility to take care for what the state, let's say the collectivity, is not taking care of, but also the women in the family are, of course, those who have the main responsibility to guarantee the care that's not, let's say, taken care by us as a collectivity, and as the state changes its roles and social guarantees receive.
Yeah, it's super interesting that at the core, the more you get into it, what you see is these like clinging and defending hierarchies, no matter what. It's not only a gender hierarchy, but also a racial hierarchy. This happens in Brazil, but this happens here. So we can think about gender ideology in its functioning in the political discourse and in the galvanizing, of different actors that agree on an agenda besides the kind of identity or alleged identity that they bring. And it is analogous to critical race theory. It's functioning in the same way, right? Would you comment on that?
Yes, that's you were perfect. It's that's it. It's there is one author, her name just now, from Eastern Europe. She says gender ideology is a symbolic glue. Elżbieta Korolczuk is her name. She says gender ideology is a symbolic glue. And why does she say that? Because the idea of gender ideology has been strategically used to sometimes censor, sometimes to delegitimate agendas which are egalitarian, which are critical to hierarchies organizing inequalities in societies. So just to tell you two examples in Latin America, in Brazil, when we were discussing the National Plan of Education for 2022 to 2032, the discussion about the National Plan of Education found the opposition of conservative actors against a part of the National Plan of Education that defined that content to discuss gender violence and to discuss gender inequalities should be developed by schools. around the country, public schools around the country. And they were successful. They were able to veto, to put a veto on a part of the National Plan of Education. And when you take a look at this part and what was then left out of the Plan of Education, it speaks of gender violence, gender equality, but also racial violence and racism. It was actually a part of the plan defining a content which was critical to hierarchies which are central to Brazilian inequalities and violence, and violence in society. Another example had to do with a campaign against gender ideology at schools, which is called Con mis hijos no te meta, don't mess with my children, which started in Peru and spread throughout many Latin American countries since 2015. And it's interesting because the idea that the parents should define the content to which their children are exposed to at schools has to do with the idea that children should not have sex education at school, that the parents should educate them according to their morality, but also to a very homogeneous way to conceive societies which are heterogeneous and plural. So I always like to bring this to discussions, because we have to understand that it has to do with equality, but also with plurality. Mm-hmm. And when we are not open to discuss race, ethnicity, gender, we are actually conceiving the society as more homogeneous than it in fact is. So we are denying the heterogeneity of society and denying a plural approach to deal with the differences that constitute societies.
Because it brings together equality and plurality. Is the equality for plurality, and that is the exact, opposite pole to, hierarchies. So there's a concept that you use, by Juan Marco Vaggione, which is the reactive politicization, right, of gender, and it could be a reactive politicization of equal relations, of race, which leaves us with this reality, if I may put it that way, that it doesn't matter whether the actors are conservative, neoliberal, religious, or secular, but what matters is the kind of agenda that they're pursuing, and they are actually able to confluence, right? Like just to have an agenda in common, very different actors. So at the same time that the feminist movement has grown, this paradoxically has also allowed these actors to agree, that's the word I was missing, agree in this reactive agenda, right? How do you see this backlash? Because this also goes to the core of your work in terms of the relationship of the feminist movement and democracy, and why you say that the feminist movement is the key, movement to democracy today.
Well, just going back to something that we have discussed before, I said that the human rights international system has expanded to include issues such as gender and race, and gender in particular since the 1970s and 80s have actually not only been included in the human rights international agenda, but has changed this agenda, has affected this agenda in very important ways. And this is what we could define as the politicization of gender by progressive movements and by human rights advocates. This means that many issues that could before be seen as domestic, private issues, such as violence against women, for example, domestic violence against women, they have become political in the sense that we recognize their collective importance and we understand that it's necessary to find public alternatives to this kind of suffering that women around the world are inflicted on. So the politicization has happened as feminist movements, human rights movements, anti-racist movements have brought to public debate issues not only as issues which were part of individual lives, but as part of how societies are structured. So we own people answers, which are also publicly produced through legal marks, through public policy. And when we see how the backlash has been organized since the end of the 1990s in particular, we see that it's a backlash against a certain conception of democracy. It's interesting to think about that. It's not only a backlash against this human rights, this changed human rights agenda. It's also a backlash against a certain conception of democracy. Social rights need a responsible state to be produced and implemented. There are no social rights if we don't have a conception of a responsible state. And it's interesting to see that in the 1990s, when these struggles, they really become more acute, that's also the moment when we start to see democracies being eroded and changing in patterns that now are clearer to us. Because I don't know if the people here are aware of that, but we finished the 20th century with the highest number of democracies in the world. And then we have a decline in the number of democracies as measured by different indexes, from the Economist indexes, varieties of democracy indexes, just to quote two that are very different among them. And when we get to the second decade of the 21st century is when it's clearest how much gender, race, plural conceptions of democracy and the human rights agenda, they are all politicized reactively and in a way that ends up justifying authoritarian approaches to politics or the autocratization of some countries, such as Hungary, such as Brazil. So it's interesting how Orban in Hungary or Bolsonaro in Brazil, they both speak very systematically of an order which is not a democratic order. It's a family value-based order. It's interesting. And it's a hierarchical order, a very clearly hierarchical order. And it's also a concept of nation that they bring as part of this order, which is much more homogeneous than the actual nations they govern at the moment.
Yeah, there's so much to unpack in what you say. I don't even know where to start. But what's very interesting, just to provide an example, is that the more these movements, advance, the more the reaction, you get, because you see this danger, right, in a time of uncertainty. So you react to the new and cling, to the old that is in your benefit. also these movements are against this kind of Marxist ghost, right? Because they equate equality and state provision of public and collective access, you know, as Marxist. So there is this element also into the mix. And what's very interesting, just as an example that illuminates issue of wider importance, but once you have like the first Black president in the US, then you had Trump. When you had a woman's president in Brazil, then you had Bolsonaro, right? So it is just this visceral reaction to any gist of real equality in social relations. And this is what you were, you know, discussing, because Dilma, you said then if you can tell what happened with impeachment.
Yes, of course. It's interesting because I will have to just very quickly go back to our transition to democracy. There is a Brazilian author, a Brazilian researcher of public policy, my colleague Martha Hedge. She says that democracy in Brazil after 1988, when we had our new constitution, was at the same time a more pluralistic regime if compared to what politics was before 1988, but also a regime in which it was possible to put the fight against inequalities. You maybe know that Brazil is one of the most unequal countries in the world. So to put the fight against inequality as a democratic agenda, to define what a democratic agenda is as one which has the fight against inequality at its core. And this was possible because it was a more pluralistic system, political system, and a public environment. Well, that's how we could develop not only legal marks related to redistribution and concerning the deep inequalities of the country, but also public policy to address injustices and inequalities of different kinds. And when we elect President Lula in 2002, you spoke of the first woman president, but Lula was the first worker president and in Brazil, and one of the first worker presidents in Latin America. He was really engaged in the fight against the dictatorship and for labor rights in Brazil, and was one of the founders of the Workers' Party, which is up to this moment the biggest left-wing party, Workers' Party in Latin America. So when Lula was elected president, he was elected as part of a heterogeneous alliance, but of course it expanded the space for social agendas and social movement actors to be part of policymaking. And that's when the backlash actually starts. Its origins are there as this displacement that was possible because social rights and social movements as actors have become more central than in previous decades, even in our democratic cycle. So when Dilma Rousseff was elected, you add to that the fact that you had a woman president, which had for the first time 40% of her ministers, which were women, and were women leading important cabinets. This was also, it was not that there were almost 40% of women, but they were leading important cabinets. And I think this is right. You can clearly see the backlash mounting. One other thing, which is very different from Argentina, is that in Brazil, we never had a transitional justice, clearing out the crimes by the dictatorship, the crimes by the state during the dictatorship. And well, Dilma Rousseff, the president, the woman president, she was in jail as an oppositional actor against the dictatorship. So she installed.
I just want to clarify that
Okay.
there was people may or may not know, but in Argentina in '83, once dictatorship was over, there was the major trial to the military juntas, and you know, the main perpetrators were convicted, and these came to provide not only, you know, concrete justice, but symbolic justice to the country, which makes a huge difference in how democracy moved later, regardless of what happened, you know, later in Argentina.
Exactly.
Sorry.
No, sorry. I really thank you for clarifying that, because just to have the comparison, when Dilma Rousseff was elected, that's when the Commission of Truth, or Truth Commission, was installed in Brazil. Mm-hmm. This is 2010. This is after 2010. So that's when the backlash ended up having as one of its main actors the military, which are now a very important part of the Bolsonaro government. So you spoke before about these alliances between different actors and these coalitions. So right now, the Bolsonaro government is really a government formed by a coalition, which is very important to understand the backlash, as they are all actors which are advocates for an order that they saw as being disrupted by the worker party's government and by the presence of a woman in the presidency in Brazil.
Yeah, so that's excellent, because what we're seeing in like three different dimensions, we have labor that defies, you know, the order, allegedly the natural order of those who have and those who do not, you know, the issue of capitalism that I mentioned at the beginning, to race as well, as we can see clearly in the US, but definitely clear in Brazil, and gender. And these three dimensions have to do with equality. So what I can't, you know, help but thinking is that, you know, anti-abortion, it's a cause that is very dear, you know, to my heart. And in the dark moments of the pandemic, the ultimate happiness was that, you know, December 30th, when the law for free and safe abortion was passed in Argentina. Well, here it was the 29th of December, because we lived one day behind in the West Coast. But the anti-abortion is not about pro-life, but it's about anti-equality. Because if you provide the right to abortion, what you are giving the woman is the possibility to do what she wants and not stay at home caring for kids, right? And not being the support for the capitalist or you know, the male economy. So I wanted to ask you, the passing of the law in Argentina is a stark contrast with the reality today in Brazil and the reality today in the US. And I know that you look at the US closely. What would be your insights, analytical and strategic insights, to distill from the Argentine experience that could illuminate, you know, the reality of the US vis-a-vis abortion? It's a difficult question, I know.
Yeah. First, I think it's very interesting the way you framed abortion as an egalitarian agenda, and I always include that, even in theoretical discussions. To discuss abortion is to discuss citizenship, is discussing not only individual rights, but how we conceive of citizenship. And it's also to bring to the debate on democracy something that has been artificially separated by capitalism, which is how reproductive, how the reproductive dimension of life connects to the political and to the productive, the economic dimension of life. So when we speak of women's autonomy to define what they do with their reproductive capacity, we are discussing how citizenship is conceived and how the dimension of reproduction of social life is connected to the political and to the productive dimension. And I think this is very important because this makes us understand that the opposition to the right to abortion is very complex. It has to do with much more than to define when life starts and how is the social hegemonic morality defining the rights of women to define if they will or not keep a pregnancy. Well, in Brazil, as well as in the States, what we see today is that we are facing very actively action to reduce rights which already exist. So this is what is common between Brazil and the US. Sometimes the actors, they can be compared. It's interesting how they, like these strategies are common strategies, but I think that the main thing, if compared to other countries in the world at the moment, is that these actors, they are really aiming at legal marks, legal norms, which allow or selectively allow women to decide about a pregnancy. In Brazil, abortion is criminalized, but there are 3 exceptions. When the woman's life is at risk, when the pregnancy is due to violence, to rape, and when the fetus is anencephalic since 2012. This is the 3rd exception. What have the conservative actors been trying in the last years, and they're still trying, and there are bills proposing that they are trying to criminalize these exceptions. They are trying to criminalize any interruption of pregnancy, even when it's a consequence of rape. So it's interesting to think about that because the first 2 exceptions that I mentioned, they exist in Brazil since 1940. So why are they now trying to keep a woman who was raped from deciding if she wants or whether she wants or not to keep a pregnancy? So my answer would be that there is an attempt to increase, to strengthen the control over women's bodies in times of deep changes. Like gender relations in society, they have changed very much in the last decades, be it in Latin America or in the US. In controlling women's bodies and women's capacity to reproduce is a way to control the way the social order is organized in times of deep crisis, economic crisis, and democratic crisis.
Yeah, you mentioned in one talk that I heard you gave about neoliberalism and precarization, that in moments of precarization, as now, to get on top of the pandemic, the more uncertainty there is, the more you cling and try to sustain what that worked, allegedly, right? And there's a parallel with this with white supremacy. I mean, this is not to justify, but to understand there's a huge time of defiance, and a lot of actors are not willing to, to let go their position for a new world. And also there is an interesting tension. I mean, I'm going a little bit theoretical here, but between freedom and equality, because these two values are at stake. And I'm taking the example of abortion. It is the freedom of the woman to decide. It is about preserving an unequal order, because it actually doesn't make any sense that it's pro-life, because the same actors that are pro-life are for death penalty. So it tells you that there's something else underlying. I know I'm going into a self-indulging, detour, as we discussed in the past. But how do you see then, if you could extrapolate from the Argentine experience, certain strategies that you would think, that you would think would work or could be advanced or explored in the reality, in the dark reality, if I may add, of the US vis-a-vis abortion?
Sorry, I forgot to comment on that. You had already mentioned it, and
that's why I'm here.
So it's interesting if we think that since 2020, we had 3 important Latin American countries decriminalizing abortion, and the 3 of them are countries where the Catholic Church has had a historically important role and is very close to the state. So Argentina first, then Mexico, then Colombia. And one of the things we have been discussing a lot, researchers of the struggles concerning abortion in Latin America, is the fact that there are different strategies and different paths to the decriminalization of abortion in these countries. So I think Argentina is a very, very interesting example, and because it is really a bottom-up process. The expansion of the debate on abortion and the connection between the criminalization of abortion and violence against women has been produced by feminist movements as they themselves expanded and changed along 2 decades. Like the campaign, the print that you brought here, it's like I really love to hear my Argentinian colleagues, friends, speaking of these 2 decades of the campaign for legal abortion in Argentina, and how they have been connected to the national feminist meetings in the country, and the circulation of feminist women and groups throughout the countries, and meeting in these encounters that happened along more than 2 decades, and how the expansion of the debate was also a process of auto-organization by feminist movements, and the building of strategies to touch public agents, artists, professionals from different areas, unionized workers who were not necessarily open to this agenda. So I think it's first a bottom-up process, which really depended on collective organization and the expansion of this collective organization, including the new generations as they came along these 2 decades. Second, they were strategic to building coalitions. I think this is central. Abortion is not a particular issue. It's not a women's issue. It's a social issue. It's a issue concerning democracy, and that's how Argentinian feminists have been able to build it as a national debate, not a feminist debate, a national debate on women's possibility to decide about a pregnancy. Colombia and Mexico have a different history. It's interesting because there are very active feminist movements, but the decriminalization in both countries came through courts, through the superior courts. And it's a different way to build even the argument for abortion, because they were clearly built as fundamental rights, fundamental constitutional rights. In Brazil, we have kind of a mixture of both, but mostly what we have been seeing is that feminist movements have been resorting to superior courts, in particular to our Supreme Court, to our Constitutional Court. And that's how the third exception has been determined. And that's how a action to decriminalize abortion until the 22nd week has been received by our Supreme Court in 2018, and followed by a public audience on the theme, which was on the issue, which was important to expand the debate. Bolsonaro has put as one important stake for him to point conservative ministries to the superior, to our superior constitutional court. Why has he done that? And he has pointed one now, which is really engaged in anti-abortion movements. He's an evangelic judge. And it's interesting because why has he done that? Because they have it very clear that in Brazil, the judicial path through the superior courts has started to be being trailed, such as in Colombia and Mexico. So that's what they are trying to stop there.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Those two trajectories that you are mentioning, because in the U.S. we know what happened with the last appointment to the Supreme Court. So what seems to be, well, this is science fiction here, right? But one very important element that you mentioned is the activism of younger generations, and societies like Brazil and Argentina have like a strong activism history, particularly before and after dictatorships. We go back to this original point, and it's an open question whether the younger generation, las pibas, as it was said, in Spanish, the young girls, it doesn't translate very well, right? But whether it's in their hands, actually, and that is not happening. Another thing that you mentioned was like alliances. I see with a lot of difficulty transversal alliances in the US. It has a history of pitting groups against each other, even though, of course, there have been alliances throughout time. And I was going to say something else, and I forgot. Yes, the public health authorities, right? This issue that you mentioned of bringing to a national debate as like a public health issue, here it's just not flying at all. It's an issue that I am surprised that has been completely inexistent in the debate about abortion. I want to see whether someone...
And it's been so important because that has been a very important strategy to bring the debate on abortion to this place of a national debate. And I think that I mentioned, and in Brazil, it's very important at the moment, but at the same time, we have like very recent examples. Last week, the ex-president Lula is now a pre-candidate to presidential elections this year. And he mentioned abortion as a public issue last week. And there was a huge reaction against it by right-wing actors. But interestingly and unfortunately, progressive actors have also gone public to say, well, we need to win Bolsonaro over, so Lula should not discuss this kind of issue. It's too controversial to mention. So it's interesting because, as you said, if you can conceptualize it as a public health issue, you can bring that out as something that should concern everyone. That is a national issue. When it doesn't come as a national, as a health issue, it's more difficult to do that. So the reaction was not only to the fact that he mentioned abortion, but to the fact that he mentioned abortion as a public health issue.
Mm-hmm. No, that's excellent. I haven't allowed time for people to ask questions. So if you want to ask a question, please put it in the chat. But this, of course, this is a topic that, as your expertise and your passion, it's not my expertise, but it is my passion. And what I wanted to say also about, the issue of abortion that also create these alliances with workers. So there are different configurations, identity configurations and agenda configurations, that build alliances around these issues. And another issue I want to bring to the attention, the audience, that the feminist movement, it has a clear kind of precedence that is Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, but it starts kind of articulate against femicides, right? Against political violence, like ni una menos, not one less, about these assassinated girls, women, usually, of not high socioeconomic status, but not exclusively, right? Those are the most invisibilized. Also the ones, it adds up, who do not have the resources, even though criminalized, to have clandestine abortions, in conditions of health that are not conducive. The same that it happens here in the US to the poorest women and women, Black, Latinas, more than, anyone else. So it's a movement that has been redefining its alliances and its strategy, in particularly after the defeat in 2018, the law. Can you speak about that redefinition of strategy?
Yeah, I think it's interesting to take a look at how this redefinition had really to do with the understanding that it's important to speak of abortion as a matter, as we said before, of public health, but also as a matter of justice. And reproductive justice is something that goes beyond the specific right to decide about whether to interrupt or not a pregnancy. Well, so first, I think that the connection to violence is very important because you put women's body at the core of the debate about justice. I think that's important. One other thing is that it's interesting how Argentinian feminist movements were capable of discussing how denying women the right to decide about the interruption or not of a pregnancy was part of keeping an order that violates them on a daily basis. Like this denial is not specific, it's part of an order. And I think that's also something that is very, very important. And I think that in Brazil, we have something that could be very strategically for the US as well, which is the alliances with anti-racist movements, with Black women in particular. And it's interesting because that's how in Brazil the idea of reproductive justice has gained ground. And it's important because we speak of the right to abortion at the same time as we speak of the right to maternity, of the right to being a mother in safe conditions for the woman and her children, safe conditions to raise their children. Because in Brazil, the women who end up having to go through clandestine abortions are the same women who are mothers, who are having a difficult time to take care of their children, the children that they love so much, because of the precariousness of work, but also the precariousness of life. State violence against Black people in poor areas in Brazil, it's like it's really systemic. So I think that's very important because data in Brazil shows that women who make an abortion, who interrupt a pregnancy, they are mothers mostly. So these are not two different women. Mothers who care for their children, women who need an abortion, they might be the same one. So what are we doing as a society for these women? What kind of violence are they having to deal with concerning their bodies, their children, their integrity?
But it makes sense because it is so radical. That is so radical because what it's doing is actually articulating substantial equality with substantial liberty, with substantial collective access to the full benefits of society. It defies the core of society. That's why, the reaction, it's it is like the nodal point of the order, or not the democratic order.
It's a very substantial way to define freedom as well. It's not the same as the freedom to wear masks or not during the pandemic of COVID-19, which kind of reduces the concept of freedom to an individual decision, which has nothing to do with the collective, the collectivity. It's a more substantive way to conceive freedom, which, as you said, connects freedom to equality and to the importance of our connections to each other.
There's a question here, and before going to the what am I doing? Oh, this is the full transcript. I'm in the wrong thing. What I want to say before asking this question, Flavia, is that I heard in that, that conference, or like there was a panel that you said something that I found that it was a gem, that those who are against reproductive rights are for the reproduction of society as it is. I mean, you didn't say it in those terms, you said it in better terms, but that was the gist, and I found so much knowledge in that particular phrase. So thank you for that. So I'm gonna go to Jonah's question. You're touching on what I have felt about the feminist movement since the 60s, 70s. We should positively identify what we envision for everyone. This is a great point. As a closure of your conversation, if you want to add anything, Flavia, that you haven't said.
That's very, very important. What feminism needs to state clearly, it's project for society. It's not, because it's so, I think the potential of feminist approach to the state, to the interconnection between individuals, is exactly that it has a social project which recognizes both the importance of freedom and how much interrelated and interconnected we are. So it's interesting because when we started here, Mara asked about, well, how did you go from participation to family? And it's interesting because I have research on abortion, but I have research on care as well. And I think what brings this all together is that feminist theory and feminist activism brings a possibility for us to think of society not as a collection of separate individuals, but as a very complex, differentiated collective of interconnected people. The idea that we need each other is so important for feminism. So one thing I like to bring, I'd like to bring just to as like a final note about feminist movement in Latin America and in Brazil in particular, is that it's interesting how feminist movements have a very clear agenda concerning public health, and the role of the state to guarantee people's health. At the same time that it brings abortion and motherhood as important agendas. So why is that? It's because it conceives of the public and the individual in a very interconnected way. And it conceives of freedom to decide, freedom to live without violence as one side of the coin. And the other is the possibility to live within communities and relationships that we value, that we want to be respected in society. So I think that's why it's so important also in its, this is for another conversation, but in its opposition against neoliberalism, because it has a clear conception of the responsibility of the state and the interconnectedness between all of us.
I was going to make a point exactly about that, Flavia. I was going to say it's so radical, feminism, because it defies the illusion and the fallacy of society as an aggregation of individuals in all respects. And that's radical, particularly for societies like the US, but not only. You know, it defies the idea of individual responsibility and individual morality as the basis of society. Yeah. And that's revolutionary.
And that's why, in my understanding, political feminist theory or feminist political theory has the most interesting and complex approach, both to autonomy and dependency, because it recognizes dependency, it recognizes the interconnectedness between people and the collective reality of society, as it also understands, because of the position of women in the different societies, that guaranteeing individual integrity, individual autonomy is also very important, but not guaranteeing it in an abstract way. If we live as if we lived aside of society, as if we lived separated of society. No, as part of communities which are important for us, relationships which are not only important but necessary.
And if I may add to that wonderful way that you have to put it, in a transversal way and not in a hierarchical way.
Yes.
So that's the other element that I see.
That's great.
Flavia, I could continue talking to you on and on, but I want to respect people's time. I'm sure that they were overwhelmed with your insights and expertise. And I would like to thank you very much. Obrigada. This has been wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And I hope to have you some other time in the future.
Of course. It was a pleasure for me. Thank you very much, Mar. I really enjoyed your questions, and I hope we can keep talking.
Okay. And thank you, everyone, very much. I don't know whether Derek is going to close the session.
I'm here. Yes. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. The link to the discussion group is there in the chat if you'd like to join the discussion group today at noon. And Professor Biroli, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's hectic being in another place, but I really appreciate all your insights. Obrigado.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.